Before the marble there was the mud, before the triumphal arches, the gold-leaf temples, the gleaming statues with their vacant painted eyes. There was a city of bone-tired people, waking before dawn in rooms they could touch wall to wall with outstretched arms. A city of smoke and shouting, of stale bread and sour wine, of the perpetual inescapable smell of 2 million human beings crammed into a valley between 7 hills and told, against all reason, that they lived at the centre of the world. Rome, at its height, was home to somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, a population density that would not be matched anywhere in the Western world for another 1,500 years. The poets called it the Eternal City. The emperors called it the Jewel of Civilization. The average Roman, the fuller treading urine-soaked wool in a vat behind the Aventine, the street vendor frying chickpea fritters over a charcoal brazier outside the Colosseum, the slave carrying a senator's litter through the mud-choked lanes of the Suburra at midnight, would have called it something considerably less flattering. This is not a story of generals or emperors. It is not the story of the Senate or the legions or the spectacular machinery of conquest that carried Rome's eagles from the Thames to the Euphrates. All of that happened. All of that was real. But beneath it, running like a dark river beneath the gleaming surface of marble civilization, was another Rome entirely. A Rome of crumbling apartment blocks 6 stories high, with no running water above the ground floor. A Rome where the streets filled with sewage when it rained and filled with bodies when it didn't. A Rome where a man might earn just enough to eat today, and nothing at all tomorrow. Where slaves slept in the same rooms as their masters and woke to work that would never end. Where the rich threw banquets that lasted until dawn while the poor queued at the bread dole before sunrise. We have their buildings, or what remains of them. We have their roads and their aqueducts, their laws and their literature, their mosaics and their graffiti. We have the fossilized remains of a lunch left uneaten in Pompeii. We have the wax-writing tablets of a debt collector in Roman London. We have the letters of a woman named Claudia Severa, inviting her friend to a birthday party on Hadrian's Wall, the oldest surviving handwritten document by a woman in the Latin world. And from all of this, from the fragments and the ruins and the accidental archaeology of catastrophe, we can begin to reconstruct not the Rome of textbooks and triumphs, but the Rome of daily existence, the Rome of early mornings and aching backs and crowded streets, the Rome where most people lived not in marble palaces but in mud-brick rooms stacked on top of each other, listening to their neighbours fight through walls thin as paper. This is the mud and the marble. This is the grim, vivid, sometimes brutal, occasionally beautiful reality of what it meant to be alive, truly alive, in the body, in the streets, in the smell and noise and press of it, in ancient Rome. And it begins, as all Roman days began, before the sun came up. The law said that wheeled vehicles could not enter Rome during daylight hours. This was not, as it might first appear, an act of civic mercy. It was a practical concession to the utterly chaotic reality of Roman streets, streets so narrow, so choked with pedestrians, so layered with the detritus of 2 million daily lives that a cart attempting to move through them at noon would simply stop, wedged between a fish stall and an argument, and stay there until nightfall. So instead, the carts came at night. From dusk to dawn, Rome roared. The poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD, complained, with the exhausted fury of a man who had not slept properly in years, that the unceasing clatter of wagons through the Roman night made sleep impossible. He wrote that a man could die of insomnia in Rome. He was probably not entirely joking. For the average Roman, the night was not quiet. It was not dark exactly. The city kept torches burning, wealthy households threw light from their windows, the moon reflected off the Tiber, but it was loud, and it was dangerous. The street gangs that Rome's emperors periodically attempted to suppress moved after dark. The open drains, the city's informal sewer system in the less connected districts, smelled worst in the small hours, when the heat of the day had had time to work on them. Dawn came for most Romans, not with an alarm but with the city itself. The carts began to thin. The first bakers were already at work. Roman bakers famously worked through the night, since the dough had to be set the evening before and the oven stoked by the 3rd hour of night. By the time the sun rose, the bread was already cooling. The smell of it, wheat and char and warmth, was the first good thing about a Roman morning. The day, in Rome, was measured differently than we measure it today. The Romans divided daylight into 12 equal hours regardless of the season, which meant that a summer hour was considerably longer than a winter one. Sunrise was always the first hour, noon was always the 6th, sunset always the 12th. A Roman invited to a dinner at the 9th hour knew, without consulting anything, that his host expected him to arrive in the mid-afternoon. By the first hour the city was already fully awake. The tabernae, the small shop-front businesses that lined virtually every Roman street, were folding back their wooden shutters. The barbers were setting up their chairs in doorways and under colonnades, because Romans got their hair cut and their beards trimmed in the street, in public, and the barber's chair was one of the great social hubs of Roman life. Men gathered there not just for the haircut but for the conversation, the gossip, the political rumour, the news from the provinces. The clients were already on their way to their patrons. This was perhaps the most distinctly Roman ritual of the morning, the salutatio, the formal morning greeting in which men of lower social standing called upon their social superiors to pay their respects and, not coincidentally, to collect their dole, the sportula, a basket of food or a small sum of money given by the patron to his dependents. This was not charity exactly. It was a social contract as old as Rome itself. The patron needed clients to swell his retinue, to demonstrate his importance, to vote as he directed and support him in the unpredictable theatre of Roman political life. The client needed bread. For the clients, this was often the worst part of the day. Martial, the great epigrammatist of the 1st century, wrote about the indignity of scrambling out of bed before dawn, pulling on his toga in the cold. He complained that togas were never quite warm enough, that they were beautiful and uncomfortable in equal measure, and hurrying across the city to arrive at the patron's door at a respectable hour, only to wait in a crowded vestibule with dozens of other clients, most of them poorer and more desperate than he was. The walk itself was an ordeal. Roman streets had no footpaths in most districts. Pedestrians walked alongside carts, alongside mules, alongside the occasional ox. The streets were not clean. The Roman city had remarkable infrastructure for its age. The aqueducts that brought fresh water in, the great Cloaca Maximus sewer that drained the Forum. But these systems did not reach everywhere, and where they did not reach, people improvised. The stepping stones that archaeologists have found in Pompeii, those distinctive large stones set into the street so that pedestrians could cross without wetting their feet, tell us something important about what was in the street. It was not rainwater, it was everything. Kitchen waste, urine, the runoff from the fuller's vats, the leavings of animals, the casual disposal of whatever people did not wish to carry to the public latrines. The smell was, by all accounts, profound. And yet Romans moved through it. They navigated it the way that people in any intensely urban environment learn to navigate the unpleasant, with practiced inattention, with the slight withdrawal of the senses that allows you to live in a place you could not endure as a stranger. Rome was their city. They belonged to it, and it to them, mud and all. The Roman morning was the busiest time. Business was conducted in the morning. Court cases were heard in the morning. The baths would not open until midday at the earliest. The water had to be heated, which took hours, and most Romans worked until the 6th hour. Then, if the day was kind, there would be a meal, a rest, the baths in the afternoon, and the long communal evening. But first, the street, the crowd, the noise, the mud drying on the hem of your toga. The Roman day had begun. When Augustus became the first emperor of Rome, one of the first things he did was regulate the height of apartment buildings. He capped them at 70 Roman feet, roughly 20 metres. This was not aesthetic legislation. It was because the buildings kept falling down. The insulae, literally islands, because they rose like blocks of stone from the sea of streets around them, were the dominant housing type of imperial Rome. They were multi-storey apartment blocks, often 6 or 7 stories high, built of fired brick and concrete on the lower floors, and increasingly rickety timber frame construction as they rose. They were built quickly, built cheaply, and built by landlords whose primary concern was maximum rental yield per square foot of land. They were, in the most technical sense, fire traps. The ground floor was the most desirable. It had direct street access, was furthest from the fire risk of upper floors, had the highest ceilings, and sometimes even connected to the building's own water supply from the aqueduct mains. Merchants often lived in the rooms behind their tabernae, sleeping surrounded by their stock, amphorae of olive oil, bolts of cloth, bundles of dried herbs. The smell was the smell of their livelihood. Above the ground floor, the rents dropped with every flight of stairs climbed. A second-floor apartment might be respectable, a few rooms, a proper doorway, perhaps a small balcony of dubious structural integrity from which one could observe the chaos of the street below. By the fourth floor, the rooms were small and the walls thin, and the landlord's obligations minimal. By the sixth floor, you were under the roof, breathing the hot air that had risen from 5 floors of cooking fires and human bodies, and the ceiling above you was nothing but wooden beams and terracotta tiles. Water did not go above the ground floor. Tenants on upper floors carried water up in jugs from the public fountains, and Rome had many of them, fed by the extraordinary aqueduct system that delivered hundreds of millions of litres of fresh water to the city daily. The water itself was free. The carrying was simply the daily physical labour of existence. Women and slaves made multiple trips, morning and evening. Fire was the great terror of the insula. There was no central heating. Rome had underfloor heating systems, the hypocaust, but these were luxuries of the wealthy domus, not the rental apartment. Tenants on upper floors heated their rooms with portable braziers, small iron or clay vessels filled with glowing charcoal. They cooked, when they cooked at all, on the same braziers, or on small clay ovens set on wooden shelves above wooden floors, in rooms with low timber ceilings. The fire risk was not theoretical. It was the background hum of daily existence, the thing you noticed when the wind changed direction at night, and you lay awake listening to the building settle. Rome burned regularly. The Great Fire of 64 AD, Nero's fire, though whether Nero actually started it remains genuinely uncertain, destroyed perhaps a third of the city. It was the most catastrophic of a long series of urban fires, and it prompted Nero to rebuild the affected districts with wider streets and more stone construction. But the insula kept going up cheaply, and kept burning. The vigils, Rome's combined night watchman and fire brigade, were organised specifically to patrol at night looking for fires and to respond when they found them. Their equipment consisted primarily of buckets, hooks for pulling down burning buildings, and the hope that they would arrive before the structure was too far gone. The buildings also fell down, not just burned, collapsed. Juvenal wrote with savage irony about the many layers of danger in a Roman apartment block. The fire risk, the structural risk, the risk from the cracks already visible in the third story, the window box some careless tenant was watering that would certainly eventually fall off the ledge and kill someone below. He wrote about the nightmare of sleeping in a building wondering which would happen first, the fire or the collapse. And yet, and this is important, the insula was also home. People decorated their rooms with what they had: painted walls, small household shrines to the lares and penates, the household gods who watched over the family's fortunes. They kept animals in defiance of landlords who probably would have banned them if they could have enforced the ban. They grew herbs in clay pots on their windowsills. They knew their neighbours, could not help but know them given the walls, and formed the dense, combustible social networks that made a neighbourhood. The street below the insula was an extension of the living space. Because the rooms were so small, so hot in summer, so dark, Roman life overflowed into the street. People ate outside, they socialised outside, they argued outside. The barber's chair on the corner was an open-air living room. The fountain at the end of the block was the neighbourhood's shared water cooler, social centre and meeting place. The rich, of course, did not live like this. The wealthy Roman lived in a domus, a single-family house built around a central atrium open to the sky, with a garden courtyard, separate rooms for family members, and the kind of spatial generosity that, in a city of this density, was the most visible possible display of power. The domus had running water piped directly from the aqueduct. It had mosaic floors and painted walls and a dedicated kitchen and a proper latrine. It had space. Space, in Rome, was the ultimate luxury. Space meant you did not hear your neighbours' arguments. Space meant your children did not sleep in the same room as your slaves. Space meant that when the building across the street caught fire at the third hour of the night, you were far enough from the walls that you had time to gather your things. Most Romans would never set foot in a domus except as a servant or a client. Their world was the insula, the narrow stair, the shared landing, the neighbour whose name you knew whether you wanted to or not, the smell of their cooking and the sound of their quarrels and the sight every morning of their cloak hanging outside the door to air. This was home. Small, loud, precarious, irreplaceable. Home. Most Romans did not cook at home. This is not because Romans were uninterested in food. Roman culinary culture was rich, sophisticated, and sometimes spectacularly strange. It is because most Romans had no kitchen. The upper-floor insular apartment had no hearth, no chimney, no way to safely contain a cooking fire, and the landlord had generally forbidden the kinds of open-flame cooking that would, at some point, inevitably set the building alight. And so, the Roman working population ate out. The thermopolium was the Roman equivalent of a fast food counter, and they were everywhere. Archaeological surveys of Pompeii have identified over 80 thermopolia in a city of perhaps 20,000 people, one for every 250 inhabitants. In Rome itself, the density would have been similar. They were simple in form. A masonry counter set into the street frontage of a building, with circular openings cut into the stone surface into which clay storage pots, dolia, were sunk to keep their contents warm. Behind the counter, a small cooking area. Above it, sometimes, a painted sign advertising specialities. What did Romans eat from thermopolia? Archaeology at Pompeii has given us remarkable specificity. Analysis of the dolia and the drains behind thermopolium counters has revealed duck, chicken, goat, pork, fish, specifically the bones of tuna, sea bream and mullet, snails, olives, and a variety of legumes. One Pompeian thermopolium served a stew that contained traces of horse meat. Roman food was not squeamish. The staple of the Roman diet for the vast majority of the population was grain. Bread, primarily. Rome's freeborn citizens were entitled to a monthly grain dole, the frumentatio, which provided enough wheat to bake a modest daily ration. This was not generosity on the part of the state. It was politics. The emperor who let the grain supply fail was the emperor who faced riots, and Roman history is full of such riots. The grain had to come from somewhere, from Sicily in the early Republic, from Egypt and North Africa in the imperial period, and it had to keep coming, across hundreds of miles of sea routes every month. Bread came in various grades. The whitest, finest bread, made from the most refined flour, was for the wealthy. Working Romans ate bread made from coarser flour, darker, denser, more filling, and baked in the large communal bakeries whose charred stone ovens archaeologists have found throughout Pompeii and Rome's port city of Ostia. Roman bread was round, and often pre-scored into sections, not for portion control but so that it could be broken along the score lines rather than cut. Knives were for people who could afford knives. The carbonized loaves from Pompeii, preserved in the instant of eruption, still show their score marks. Beyond bread, the Roman diet was built on olive oil, wine, and garum. Garum deserves a moment's attention, because it is perhaps the ingredient most alien to the modern palate, and most central to ancient Roman cooking. Garum was fermented fish sauce, made by layering whole small fish, typically anchovies or mackerel, with salt in large clay vessels and leaving them to ferment, sometimes for months. The resulting liquid, strained off and bottled, was a concentrated umami flavouring of extraordinary pungency and extraordinary versatility. It went on everything. Roman recipes that have survived, in the 1st century cookbook attributed to a writer called Apicius, use garum in quantities that suggest it served the purpose that we might use salt, soy sauce, and stock combined. The smell of garum production was, by all ancient accounts, catastrophic. Roman law required garum factories to be located outside the city walls, not out of any squeamishness about the industry, but because the odour was considered an active threat to urban amenity. And yet the finished product was a staple of Roman kitchens at every social level, from the rough earthenware jugs of ordinary households to the amphora of premium-aged garum, labelled with the name of the fishery and the year of production, that wealthy Romans gifted to one another like fine wine. Wine itself was the universal Roman beverage. Water was available, plentiful even, in a city served by the aqueducts, but Romans did not drink it straight if they could help it. Wine was safer, wine was sociable. Wine was, at the dilutions at which most Romans drank it, heavily watered, sometimes mixed with honey, sometimes with seawater to preserve it during transport, barely stronger than a light modern beer, and served a similar social function. To drink wine unmixed was considered a sign of either barbarian nature or dangerous excess. The mixing of wine and water was so fundamental to Roman conceptions of civilized behaviour that the vessel used to mix them, the crater, was a central object of the Roman table. The truly poor, and there were many truly poor in Rome, relied on the grain dole, on street food, on the charity of patrons, and on whatever they could grow in window boxes or purchase for the smallest denomination of Roman coin. The quadrans, the smallest copper coin, could buy a small cup of rough wine in the cheapest tavern. It could buy a few olives from a street vendor. It could not buy a meal. For the poor, hunger was never far away. The Roman economy was what historians call a subsistence economy for most of its population. The majority of people produced or earned just enough to maintain themselves, with little margin for disaster. A bad harvest, a disruption to the grain supply, illness that prevented work, any of these could tip a family from precarious sufficiency into genuine starvation. The grain dole caught some of them. The patronage system caught others. Many fell through entirely. At the other extreme, Roman elite dining was a performance that stretched the concept of eating into the realm of theatre. The triclinium, the formal dining room of a wealthy Roman house, was named for the 3 couches on which diners reclined, arranged in a horseshoe around the central table. Romans reclined to eat at formal dinners. Sitting upright was for peasants and the quick transactions of the street stall. The reclining position, leaning on the left arm, right hand free, and was slow, elaborate, social. A formal dinner, the cena, could last for hours. The food at such dinners ranged from the extremely good to the aggressively peculiar. Apicius's cookbook includes recipes for flamingo, dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts and glazed with honey, jellyfish, udders of sow in complex sauces, and sea urchin. These were the dishes of a cuisine that had access to the whole Mediterranean basin and the wealth to transport anything from anywhere. The famous Roman love of unusual food was partly genuine enthusiasm and partly conspicuous display. Serving ingredients that had come from the far ends of the empire was a statement about your connections, your wealth, and your cosmopolitan taste. Between the garum-soaked bread of the Thermopolium and the dormice stuffed with pine nuts of the senatorial dinner table, an entire civilization ate. It ate in the street and in the tavern and in the triclinium. It ate well when it could and badly when it could not, and the distance between those 2 states was, for most Romans, the distance between a good season and a bad one, between a patron's generosity and his indifference, between health and its absence. Food was politics. Food was power. Food was survival. It always tasted underneath everything of garum. Rome had a word for it: negotium, business, the opposite of otium, leisure. And the hours of negotium, the working hours of the Roman day, were the hours that most people in the city spent in motion. The Roman economy at the street level was an economy of specialists. The city's population was served by an extraordinary range of artisans, traders, professionals, and service workers, many of them organized into collegia, professional guilds that governed entry to the trade, set standards, regulated prices, and provided their members with the one social safety net that was not controlled by the state or the patron: a guaranteed funeral. The collegia paid for the burial of their members. In a city where death was always close, this was not a trivial benefit. The range of specialized trades visible in Roman sources is remarkable. We know of carpenters and painters, of fresco artists and mosaic layers, of glassblowers and gem cutters, of leather workers and tanners, of rope makers and net menders, of fullers and dyers, of blacksmiths and silversmiths, of perfumers and spice merchants, of book copyists and school teachers, of doctors and midwives, of prostitutes and gladiators, of undertakers and professional mourners hired to weep theatrically at wealthy funerals. The fillery, the fullenacy, deserves special mention, not because of its social glamour, but because it illuminates something essential about Roman resourcefulness. Fullers were fabric workers. They cleaned, thickened, and finished woolen cloth by a process of treading, soaking, and beating. The chemical agent they used for cleaning was urine, human urine. They collected it in large pottery jars placed in the street outside their establishments. Passers-by were encouraged to contribute, and used its ammonia content to bleach and clean the fabric. Rome recycled everything. The Roman working day for most artisans and small traders began at first light and ended sometime in the early afternoon, the 6th or 7th hour, roughly noon or the early afternoon by our reckoning. This was not laziness. It was a sensible adaptation to Mediterranean climate. The afternoon hours in a Roman summer were brutally hot, and the Romans, like most Mediterranean cultures, responded to the heat of the day by stopping. The afternoon was for the baths, for rest, for the slow social activities that required less physical effort. Payment for most workers was calculated daily. The Roman denarius, a silver coin, was roughly a day's wage for an unskilled labourer. Skilled craftsmen could earn more. The great poet Horace, writing about his humble origins, noted with some pride that his father had been a freedman, a former slave, who had worked as an auctioneer's assistant and had earned enough to send his son to school in Rome. This was social mobility, Roman style, not dramatic, not guaranteed, but possible. The slave economy is impossible to discuss separately from Roman work because they were inseparable. Roman slavery was not a regional or specialized institution. It was structural, universal, and present at every level of Roman economic life. Conservative estimates suggest that slaves made up perhaps 20 to 30% of the population of Italy in the late Republic and early Empire. In Rome itself, the proportion may have been higher. Slaves worked in the fields, in the mines, in the workshops, in the houses. But Roman slavery was also, in many cases, different from the plantation slavery of the early modern period in its degree of stratification. A slave who was a highly educated Greek tutor, or a skilled doctor, or a trusted financial secretary, a dispensator, might live a life of considerable material comfort and considerable actual authority. The dispensator of a wealthy senator might manage a budget that dwarfed what a free labourer would earn in a lifetime. This did not make him free. It did not make his situation just. But it made Roman slavery an enormously varied institution, ranging from the near-total annihilation of personhood experienced by miners in the Spanish silver mines to the complex negotiated relationships between educated slaves and elite owners. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, was common enough in Rome that freedmen formed a substantial and economically significant class. A freed slave became a Roman citizen, though with certain limitations on political participation. The children of freed slaves were full citizens. This created pathways, however difficult and contingent, that other slave systems largely did not. The most successful freedmen became wealthy in their own right. The sharp-tongued Trimalchio of Petronius's satirical novel The Satyricon, a grotesquely nouveau riche freedman throwing lavish banquets to demonstrate his wealth to people who will never quite accept him, was a recognizable social type. The intersection of free labor, slave labor, and freedman entrepreneurship created an economy of remarkable complexity and remarkable inequality. The wealthy senator whose investments spanned wheat farms in Sicily, fishing enterprises on the Adriatic, and property rental in Rome, all managed through his freedmen agents, was operating something that looks, from a sufficient distance, almost like a modern diversified portfolio. The woman selling dried herbs from a basket outside the Circus Maximus was operating something that looks like it has never changed in 2,000 years. Both of them were Roman. Both of them were working. Both of them were, in their different ways, parts of an economy that made the city function, that fed and clothed and built and maintained the largest urban agglomeration the Western world had yet seen. The senator retired each evening to his marble atrium in the company of his educated slaves. The herb seller, if she was lucky, retired to a room in an insula somewhere and ate what she had not sold. Negotiation was over. Otium, such as it was, had begun. If you wanted to understand Rome, you went to the baths. Not to wash, though you washed. Not to exercise, though you exercised. You went to the baths to become Roman, to participate in the one institution of Roman life that dissolved, if never entirely, the enormous social gradients of the city into something approaching shared humanity. The senator and the shopkeeper stripped off their clothes and became, for a few hours, simply bodies in warm water. The Roman baths, the thermae, were not a luxury amenity. They were a civic institution as fundamental as the aqueducts that fed them, as the roads that connected them to the rest of the empire. Rome at its peak had perhaps 1,000 bathing establishments of various sizes, from the vast imperial thermae, the baths of Caracalla, capable of accommodating 1,600 bathers simultaneously, opened in 216 AD, to the small neighbourhood balnea tucked into the ground floors of insular blocks. Entry was cheap, often it was free. Popular emperors and wealthy patrons sometimes paid the entry fees for entire days, as a public gift to the city. On days when it was not free, the cost was a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, This was deliberately, consciously affordable. The baths were part of the social contract between the Roman state and its urban population. Bread and circuses, as the satirist Juvenal acidly summarised it, the twin provisions that kept the city pacified. Bread from the grain dole, entertainment from the games, and the baths, the daily restoration of the body, the daily ritual of cleanliness and social interaction, as the essential third pillar of urban Roman life. The bathing process followed a fixed sequence, and it was as much ritual as hygiene. You arrived, leaving your clothes, your shoes, and everything valuable with a slave or a locker keeper, since theft at the baths was chronic and the Romans joked about it constantly. You entered the apoditerium, the changing room. Then you moved through the sequence of spaces that gave the Roman bath its character. The palaestra first, an open exercise courtyard where you might wrestle, play a ball game, lift weights, or simply walk. The Romans understood perfectly well the connection between exercise and health. They sweated before they washed. From the palaestra you moved into the heated rooms, the tepidarium first, the warm room, gently heated, where you adjusted gradually to the temperature change. Then the caldarium, the hot room steamy and thick, where the serious business of opening the pores and sweating out the day's accumulated grime took place. Roman bathers did not use soap. They used a combination of heat, steam, water, and the strigil, a curved bronze or iron tool like a blunt blade, used to scrape oil and sweat and dirt from the skin. You oiled yourself first, worked up a sweat in the steam, then scraped it all off with the strigil. The process was laborious enough that wealthy Romans brought slaves to do it for them. Finally, the frigidarium, the cold room and its cold pool. The plunge into cold water after the heat of the caldarium was understood by Romans in terms that we would broadly recognise today, as invigorating, as closing the pores, as completing the circuit of the body's thermal experience. It was also simply exhilarating. The frigidarium of the great imperial baths was a cathedral of cold water, the most architecturally dramatic space most ordinary Romans would ever stand in. What happened at the baths was not only physical. The baths were where Romans conducted business, maintained friendships, argued about politics, gossiped about neighbours, picked up information about job opportunities and social gossip, met potential clients or patrons, and, in ways that the more moralistic Roman writers complained about loudly, pursued romantic and sexual connections. The mixed bathing that some imperial periods permitted, or at least tolerated, was a perennial source of both delight and outrage. Emperors periodically banned men and women from bathing together. Emperors periodically stopped caring about this. The ban was applied and unapplied with the rhythm of political fashion. The baths also had libraries. They had lecture halls. They had gardens. The great thermae of the imperial period were not simply bathing facilities. They were community centres, cultural institutions, the Roman equivalent of a combined gym, cafe, library and social club. A man with enough time and a quadrans to spare could spend most of an afternoon in the baths and emerge not only clean but educated, politically informed and socially refreshed. The heating of the baths required a technology that Rome had developed and refined over centuries, the hypocaust system. Beneath the floor of the heated rooms, raised on small brick pillars, the suspensurae. Hot air circulated from a central furnace called the Prehistoric. The walls were hollow too, channeling the heated air upward to keep the entire space warm. The stokers who fed the furnaces worked in suffocating heat, shoveling wood continuously through the bathing hours. They were, almost invariably, slaves. The fuel consumption of a large bath complex was extraordinary. The baths of Caracalla required 10 metric tons of wood per day to function. Wood that had to come from somewhere, carried by cart from forests increasingly distant from the city, as Rome consumed the timber of its hinterland. The environmental cost of Roman urbanism was real, and the baths were one of its most hungry manifestations. But the bathers above knew nothing of this. They felt only the warmth rising through their feet, the steam in their lungs, the water closing over them. They heard the voices of their city around them, the overlapping conversations of Romans from every district, every profession, every rung of the social ladder that a quadrans could temporarily erase. For a few hours each afternoon, the mud of the Roman street was washed away. The city was clean. The citizens, and the slaves, and the freedmen, and the foreign merchants, and the visiting dignitaries were all briefly equal in their nakedness and their warmth. Then they dressed and stepped back out into the street and Rome reassembled itself around them. The Roman body carried everything the Roman city gave it. And the Roman city gave it a great deal. Contaminated water despite the aqueducts, since not all Romans had direct access to the clean supply. Food preservation that relied on salt, honey and hope. Air thick with wood smoke and charcoal fumes. The constant low-level toxic exposure of lead, in the pipes that carried some of the water, in the solder used in cooking vessels, in the lead acetate sweetener that Roman cooks added to wine and sauces, in the cosmetic preparations that wealthy women painted on their faces. The Romans were not unique in their ignorance of lead's dangers. They were uniquely thorough in their exposure to it. The Romans had extraordinary medical infrastructure for their time. Military medicine in particular was remarkably sophisticated. The legions had trained doctors, organised hospitals called valetudinaria, and a pragmatic understanding of wound care that, while it lacked the germ theory of disease, had developed empirically effective treatments for the most common battlefield injuries. The Roman army was better doctored than the armies of most European nations 1500 years later. Civilian medicine was more variable. At the top end, a wealthy Roman might consult a physician of genuine learning, many of them Greek, since Greek intellectual prestige dominated Roman medicine as it dominated Roman philosophy. Galen of Pergamon, the most influential physician in Roman history, wrote voluminously on anatomy, physiology, pathology, and pharmacology, and his theories, wrong in many particulars but impressive in their systematization, would dominate Western medicine until the Renaissance. He was, in the 2nd century AD, physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. For the ordinary Roman, however, the choice was between a neighbourhood physician of uncertain training and the remarkable Roman tradition of self-medication. The elder Pliny, in his Natural History, devotes enormous space to the medical properties of plants, animals, and minerals. A comprehensive survey of Roman folk medicine that ranges from the genuinely effective to the superstitious to the alarming. Romans ate cabbage for almost everything. They used honey as an antibiotic, correctly as it turns out, since honey does have genuine antibacterial properties. They applied spider webs to wounds to stop bleeding. Also not entirely wrong, since spider silk can act as a clotting scaffold. They used urine for toothache, which does not work but connects us back to the Roman conviction that nothing useful should be wasted. The great killers of urban Rome were not the dramatic mass mortality events of later history, though those came too, most devastatingly in the Antonine Plague of the 160s AD, which may have killed 5 million people across the empire, and the Plague of Cyprian in the 250s, which may have been worse. The everyday killers were familiar: gastrointestinal disease from contaminated food and water, respiratory illness from smoke and crowding, infant mortality so high that Roman demographers estimate perhaps half of all children born in the city did not survive to adulthood. Malaria, endemic in the low-lying ground around Rome, the Ager Romanus, was a constant presence. Tuberculosis, which thrives in crowded urban environments, was widespread. Children were buried differently from adults in Rome, often without the full mortuary rites, often in amphorae or simple clay vessels, in spaces that archaeologists call infant cemeteries. This is sometimes interpreted as Roman coldness toward children. The evidence does not support this. Roman parents grieved their children deeply. We have the poetry, the epitaphs, the evidence of private anguish. But Romans also understood, in a way that our culture has largely been spared from understanding, that a child's death was a common event. The emotional self-protection this required left traces in how they talked about childhood, in how some philosophers counselled against becoming too attached to a child before the age of 2. The grief was not absent. It was managed out of necessity. Surgery was practiced in Rome with a competence that modern surgeons find genuinely impressive. Roman surgical instruments, probes, retractors, scalpels, bone saws, forceps, even a device that looks remarkably like a modern speculum, have been found throughout the empire from Pompeii to the military camps of Hadrian's Wall. The quality of the metalwork is high. The instruments were designed for repeated use and repeated sharpening. Roman surgeons operated on cataracts, performed trepanation on skulls, removed bladder stones through an incision in the perineum, an operation that, without anesthesia, required the patient to be held down by multiple assistants and completed as quickly as possible, since speed was itself a mercy. The anaesthetics available to Roman surgeons were limited: wine, in large quantities, to dull the senses. mandragora root, which contains alkaloids with genuine sedative properties, opium, which was known and used. None of them produced anything approaching a modern general anesthesia. The experience of Roman surgery was, for the patient, an ordeal. The experience of Roman surgery without it was considerably worse. Pain was a constant companion in the Roman world. The pharmacopoeia of Roman medicine included effective treatments, opium for pain, willow bark preparations with genuine aspirin-like properties, various herbal anti-inflammatories. But access to these preparations was uneven, and for the truly poor, pain was often managed with nothing more than endurance and the small, powerful comfort of the household gods. And yet, by the standards of pre-modern urban life, Rome was not unusually unhealthy. The aqueducts made a real difference. The baths made a real difference. The Roman conviction that cleanliness, of the body, of the streets, at least in theory, was connected to civic virtue produced real public health infrastructure. Compared to medieval European cities, which lacked the aqueducts and the baths and the organised waste disposal systems, Rome was in some respects more sanitary. This is a low bar. The Romans would have agreed. They did not need the germ theory of disease to understand that living in a crowded city, breathing its air and drinking its water and treading its streets, was a transaction with mortality. They paid the price daily. They kept paying. The city was worth it. Or so they told themselves, in the hours before the fever came. Her name was Sulpicia. She was a Roman woman of the late 1st century BC, from a family of senatorial rank. She wrote love poetry. We know this because her poems survived. 6 elegies, preserved by accident in a collection of poems by the male poet Tibullus, apparently because someone mistakenly attributed them to him, and then, when the error was noticed, left them in anyway. They are direct, sensual, and confident. She writes about her love, about desire, about the political reality of her social situation with a clear-eyed intelligence that makes no apology for itself. Sulpicia is remarkable in the Roman record not because she was unique, but because she left traces. Most Roman women did not. The history of women in Rome is largely the history of women written about by men, in law, in satire, in the records of court cases, in the works of male poets who made women their subject. To hear women speak in their own voice requires the kind of accidental preservation that gave us Sulpicia's poems, or Claudia Severa's birthday invitation from Hadrian's Wall, or the business correspondence of women merchants preserved on papyrus in Roman Egypt. Roman law defined women primarily in relation to men. A Roman woman was, in early Roman law, always under some form of male guardianship. The patria potestas of her father, then the authority of her husband, then the guardianship of a male relative. She could not, in theory, conduct significant legal or financial transactions without her guardian's consent. She could not hold political office. She could not serve in the army. She could not vote. And yet the reality, particularly by the imperial period, was considerably more complex than this legal framework suggests. Roman women, especially wealthy ones, exercised enormous practical power. The guardianship requirement had been weakened by centuries of legal development to the point where, for many transactions, the guardian's role was largely formal. Women of the senatorial and equestrian classes managed substantial property portfolios, ran business enterprises, directed the lives of large households, corresponded with emperors, and wielded political influence that, while exercised through personal relationships rather than official position, was real, and was understood to be real. The Emperor Augustus's wife, Livia Drusilla, was perhaps the most powerful woman in Roman history, not because she held any official position, but because she was the centre of a network of relationships, loyalties, and obligations that gave her de facto influence over the succession of emperors. Roman sources, written by men who were not sure how to process her power, oscillated between portraying her as a devoted wife and a poisoning schemer, neither portrait quite adequate to the reality of a woman who navigated Roman political life for 6 decades at the highest level. For ordinary women, the horizons were different, but the resourcefulness was the same. Roman women ran tabernae. We have evidence of women as innkeepers, cloth dealers, fish sellers, and proprietors of thermopolia. They worked as midwives, as nurses, as wool workers, as entertainers. They worked as slaves in every capacity their male counterparts did. The wool trade in particular was associated with women at every level. The elite woman demonstrating her traditional virtue by spinning at home, the slave woman spinning in a workshop for 12 hours a day, the freed woman who had worked her way into running a textile business of her own. Marriage, for Roman women, typically came young. Roman law set the minimum age at 12 for girls, though the average age at first marriage in the upper classes was probably the mid to late teens. In the lower classes, economic necessity often pushed marriage later. The Roman marriage ceremony was a legal and social event as much as a religious one. The key elements were consent and cohabitation, and while there were traditional rituals, the absence of a formal ceremony did not invalidate the marriage in most legal contexts. Roman women divorced. Divorce was available to both parties and was not particularly unusual in the upper classes. Roman poets and satirists complain about women who divorce their husbands for trivial reasons, which tells us that women initiating divorce was common enough to be a recognizable social type. The children of a marriage typically stayed with the father, since children were legally under the patria potestas. This was one of the cruelties of the system, and Roman women knew it. The religious life of Roman women deserves particular note. The Vestal Virgins, 6 women who maintained the sacred fire of Vesta in the Forum Romanum and performed crucial state religious functions, occupied one of the most powerful positions in Roman religious life. They were independent, free from patria potestas, able to own property in their own right, entitled to premium seats at public events, their favour sought by powerful men. The price was 30 years of celibacy, beginning with entry to the order between the ages of 6 and 10. Violation of that celibacy was punishable by being buried alive in the Campus Sceleratus. No Vestal was condemned for this during most of the Republic without enormous political drama, because the power of the Vestals was real enough that accusations against them were understood as political weapons. Beside the Vestals, ordinary Roman women practiced religion at the household level with a consistency and seriousness that the male-dominated state religions sometimes failed to match. The household gods, the Lares and Penates, were in the care of women. The celebration of festivals, the maintenance of the household shrine, the prayers that structured the rhythm of daily life fell to the mater familias. Roman women were not excluded from religion. They were, in many senses, its daily practitioners. Roman women's lives were shaped by constraint. But constraint is not the whole story. It never is. Within the structures that the law and social convention imposed, Roman women exercised agency, pursued ambition, formed friendships, fell in love, raised children, managed money, ran businesses and left behind, in the accidents of preservation, voices of sufficient clarity that we can hear them still. Sulpicia's poems end. The wax tablet, wherever she wrote them, has long since been reused or destroyed. But the words remain, sharp, alive, unwilling to be reduced to a legal category or a literary type. She was a Roman woman. She was more than the law imagined her to be. They all were. There is a question that people always ask about the gladiatorial games, and it is the right question. How did so many ordinary Romans, not monsters, not sociopaths, but farmers and shopkeepers and children, sit in the sunlight watching people die and call it entertainment? The answer is not a comfortable one, and it does not resolve into a simple verdict on Roman character. The Romans were not uniquely cruel among ancient peoples. The sacrificial violence of many cultures and the entertainment violence of many more suggest that the Roman games existed on a spectrum of human behaviour, rather than as an aberration from it. But the games were Roman in their specific form, in their political function, in their extraordinary scale. The Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheatre completed in 80 AD under the Emperor Titus, is the most iconic building in the Roman world, and it is iconic for a reason. It could seat somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people. It had a complex system of underground service tunnels and lifts, the hypogeum, that allowed animals, gladiators, and elaborate stage sets to be brought up into the arena. It had a retractable awning, the velarium, operated by sailors stationed on the upper tier, which shaded the crowd in summer. It was, in engineering and organisational terms, an extraordinary achievement, built in the service of an institution that required industrial-scale management of violence. Gladiators were not simply condemned men thrown into an arena to die. That is a common misapprehension, and the reality was considerably stranger. Gladiators were professionals. They trained in dedicated school, the ludi, under experienced masters. They were organised by fighting style, each style with its own equipment, tactics and aesthetic. The heavily armoured Samnite, the net-wielding Retiarius, the Thraex with his curved seeker blade and small shield, the Mumio with his distinctive fish-crested helmet. Gladiatorial combat was a skilled discipline with its own traditions, its own stars, and its own enthusiastic fan culture. Some gladiators were slaves or condemned criminals with no choice in the matter, but some were free men who volunteered, drawn by the promise of pay, the appeal of violent celebrity, the institutional support of the ludus which provided food, training and medical care superior to what many free Romans enjoyed. The doctor assigned to the gladiatorial school at Pergamon in the 2nd century was Galen, who later became physician to the emperor. Gladiatorial work was not beneath the most eminent physician of the age, and it gave him unparalleled experience in wound trauma. The death rate in gladiatorial combat is a matter of genuine historical debate, and the answer matters because it changes the fundamental nature of the institution. Recent scholarship, examining the epitaphs of gladiators and the records of individual fights where we have them, suggests that the death rate per bout was considerably lower than popular imagination suggests, perhaps in the range of 1 in 5 or 1 in 10. A gladiator who survived his first 2 or 3 fights was likely to win his freedom. The rudis, the wooden sword presented to a gladiator freed from his service. Stars of the arena could become wealthy, celebrated figures. They could retire, teach, trade on their fame. This does not make the institution humane. The crowd's appetite for the games included the appetite for the real possibility of death, and fighters were killed in the arena, and the spectatorship of that killing was the social glue of the Roman entertainment experience. But the gladiator was not simply a victim. He was a performer, a professional, and sometimes a survivor. The other great spectacle of Roman entertainment was the chariot races of the Circus Maximus. And here, the emotional investment of the Roman public exceeded even the games. The Circus Maximus was the largest entertainment venue in the ancient world, with a capacity estimated at anywhere between 150,000 and 250,000 spectators. On race days, it held what may have been the largest crowd regularly assembled anywhere in the ancient world. The 4 racing factions, the blues, the greens, the reds and the whites, commanded loyalties that we might compare to modern football clubs, but with the intensity turned up considerably. Men bet their savings on races. Riots broke out between faction supporters. Emperors aligned themselves publicly with one faction or another, with political consequences. The Byzantine Empire, 8 centuries later, would nearly destroy itself in the Nika riots of 532 AD, which began as a dispute between blues and greens in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, the direct descendant of the Roman circus. The charioteer who drove for the greens was a celebrity in the same way that a modern athlete is a celebrity. His face on oil lamps and pottery, his victories inscribed in stone, his name known across the empire. Gaius Appius Diocles, a Spanish-born charioteer who drove for the Reds in the 2nd century AD, is recorded as having won 1,462 races and earned prize money totaling 35 million sestertii, a sum that, depending on your conversion methodology, would rank him among the highest-earning athletes in all of human history. He retired alive, which was not nothing. Beyond gladiators and chariot races, Rome offered theatre. Popular comedies with stock characters as recognisable as anything in modern television, performed in permanent stone theatres built to magnificent scale. It offered beast hunts in the arena, the venations, in which wild animals from across the empire, lions from North Africa, bears from the Danube provinces, elephants from Mauritania, were displayed and killed in elaborate staged hunts. It offered public executions, which were sometimes incorporated into the games and which, in a world without our architecture of institutional justice, served both as punishment and public spectacle. It is easy, and not entirely wrong, to see all of this as the Roman state keeping the population pacified with cheap excitement, bread and circuses as Juvenal said. It is also true that the games were social events in which the entire city gathered, in which the emperor appeared before his people and was judged by their cheers and silences, in which political sentiment found one of its few legitimate public expressions. The crowd at the Colosseum could communicate its wishes to the emperor in ways that were understood and sometimes acted upon. The games were not just entertainment, they were a form of politics, conducted in blood and sand and the roar of 200,000 human throats. Rome never stopped needing spectacle, not because Romans were more bloodthirsty than other people, but because they had built a city of impossible scale, and they had learned that what kept such a city together what made 2 million strangers into something that felt like a single body, was the periodic experience of watching the same thing, in the same place, at the same time, even if what they were watching was death. The Romans, it has been said, were the most religious people who ever lived. This requires some unpacking. The Romans were not religious in the way we might understand a modern person of deep faith to be religious. They did not, in general, cultivate a personal relationship with a god who demanded exclusive devotion, who offered salvation, who required internal transformation. Roman religion, in its traditional form, was primarily about correct behaviour, the right sacrifices performed at the right times in the right ways by the right people. If you did the ritual correctly, the gods were bound to respond correctly. It was, in a meaningful sense, a contractual relationship. Do et des, I give so that you might give. Sacrifice, the offering of wine, of grain, of incense, of animals, was the currency of communication with the divine, and the Romans sacrificed constantly, at every public event, before every military campaign, at the threshold of every new enterprise. The priest who could read the entrails of a sacrificed animal, the haruspex, was not a peripheral figure but a standard consultant for any Roman considering a significant decision. SFX, a bull's heavy breathing, the chant of priests, the crowd in ceremonial silence, then the single sharp blow. The Roman pantheon was famously capacious. The 12 Olympian gods at its centre, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Minerva, Diana, Apollo, Neptune, Vulcan, Ceres, Bacchus, were accompanied by hundreds of minor deities, each responsible for a specific domain of human concern. There were gods of doorways, the Bifrons Janus, guardian of beginnings and endings. There were gods of the larder and the fire. There were the lares, spirits of the household and the crossroads, given small shrines at street corners throughout the city. There were the penats, household gods of the food supply. There were the manes, the spirits of the dead who required propitiation at the annual festival of the Parentalia. Roman divinity colonized every corner of daily life. This proliferation was not chaos, it was a system. Roman religion worked by assigning divine oversight to every significant human activity and every transition between states. Birth, marriage, illness, death, the sowing and reaping of crops, the founding of cities, the beginning and end of wars. Each had its appropriate deity and its appropriate ritual. Religion was the operating system that structured Roman time and Roman space. The Romans were, famously, also tolerant of foreign religions, with important caveats. The imperial policy was generally to absorb the gods of conquered peoples into the Roman system, a practice called interpretatio Romana. The local god was identified with the nearest Roman equivalent and venerated accordingly. Jupiter merged with the Gallic sky god. Mercury absorbed dozens of local messenger and merchant deities across the empire. The Egyptian goddess Isis found an enormous Roman following, her cult temples spreading through the city with a popularity that the authorities regarded with intermittent suspicion. The cults that Rome suppressed were those it regarded as actively antisocial, involving human sacrifice, or advocating for the undermining of Roman social structure. The Druids of Gaul and Britain were suppressed partly for this reason, partly for political ones. The Christians were persecuted intermittently for reasons that were, from the Roman perspective, partly religious. Their refusal to sacrifice to the imperial gods was understood as a dangerous gesture toward the state, and partly social. Their communities were sometimes seen as secret societies with opaque loyalties. But the Christianity of the catacombs was the Christianity of a persecuted minority. Most Romans, well into the 3rd and 4th centuries, participated in the traditional religious culture of the Roman world, and that culture was rich and strange and present in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct but possible to glimpse. Superstition, the Greek word deisdaimonia, excessive fear of the gods, was, as far as educated Romans were concerned, the failure mode of proper religion. The proper relationship with the gods was businesslike, proportionate, correct. The superstitious person saw omens everywhere, feared dreams, consulted astrologers too frequently, made excessive sacrifices out of anxiety rather than piety. And yet the same texts that mock superstition also record in perfect sincerity the significance of lightning strikes as divine communications, the meaning of owl flights, the terrible portent of a hen's refusal to eat before battle, The line between religion and magic was porous in Rome, and the authorities knew it. Lead curse tablets, deficciones, have been found throughout the empire in their thousands, deposited in springs, in graves, at crossroads. Inscriptions calling on the gods of the underworld to afflict enemies with illness, impotence, financial ruin, or simply the inability to win a lawsuit. These tablets exist in the record from every social level. Not just the frustrated poor seeking leverage against powerful adversaries, but wealthy people, educated people, people who also participated in perfectly orthodox state religion. The gods could be appealed to in the courts of heaven as well as the courts of Rome. Rome's religious life was, finally, a reflection of its social life, hierarchical, transactional, publicly performed, and deeply personal simultaneously. The great state sacrifices on the Capitol were the religious life of senators and emperors. The household shrine was the religious life of the family. The crossroads shrine was the religious life of the neighbourhood. The curse tablet deposited in a spring was the religious life of the individual at the end of his rope, convinced that ordinary justice had failed him, and that only the gods of the underworld had the power to set things right. The gods heard everything in Rome. They heard prayers in 100 languages, offered in blood and grain and wine and the small clay lamps that burned all night in 1,000,000 humble rooms. Whether they answered is a matter of faith. That they were addressed, constantly, with desperate sincerity is a matter of historical record. The gods did not answer. The lamps burned on. Rome kept praying. A Roman child was not born Roman. He or she was made Roman. The process began at birth, and it was not automatic. In Roman law and custom, a newborn child was not automatically received into the family. The paterfamilias, the family's male head, had the right and the duty to lift the child from the ground, where by tradition it was placed immediately after birth, in a gesture of acceptance and acknowledgement. The child raised was the child accepted. The child not raised was in theory exposed, left outside where it might be taken in by someone else or not. This practice, infant exposure, has been used as evidence of Roman cruelty, and it undoubtedly represents a profound difference from modern values. But the evidence suggests that exposure was less common than the legal right to it suggests, and that Roman parents more often than not found the child irresistible once it was before them. The archaeology of infant cemeteries, the poetry of parental grief, the legal provisions for the registration of children, all suggest that the raising of children was, for most Roman families, the norm and the exposure the exception. Children in Rome were surrounded by toys that archaeologists have found throughout the empire. Clay dolls with articulated limbs, hobby horses, small carts, board games, knucklebones, the Roman equivalent of jacks played with actual sheep knucklebones, spinning tops, hoops. Roman children played in the streets, in the courtyards, in the spaces between adults. They had pets. Small dogs appear frequently in funerary art beside the children they belong to, the beloved animals that death separated as casually as it separated everything else. The Roman experience of childhood was compressed by the standards of modern developed world life. Childhood ended, in practical terms for most Romans, somewhere between 12 and 14. Girls were married young. Boys took on adult responsibilities, work, military service in some cases, the beginning of a career in law or commerce, while still, by our standards, very young. The toga virilis, the adult toga presented to a Roman boy at a ceremony marking his transition to formal adult status, was typically awarded between the ages of 14 and 17. Education in Rome was not universal, not compulsory, and wildly variable in quality. At the most basic level, a Roman child learned to read and write at home, from the mother or a literate slave. The Greeks who were enslaved following Rome's conquests of the Hellenistic world in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC became the tutors of their conquerors' children, and the Greek intellectual tradition entered Roman culture through this particular door. Formal schooling, for those who had access to it, proceeded in 3 stages. The literator or ludus magister ran the equivalent of a primary school, teaching reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, often in rented space in a portico or the back of a shop. The classes conducted in the morning hours while the street noise flowed around them. The grammaticus provided the 2nd stage, grammar and literature, primarily the reading and analysis of Greek and Latin texts. Homer in Greek, Virgil and Cicero in Latin were the core curriculum. The rhetorician provided the third and most prestigious stage, training in public speaking, in the construction of arguments, in the performance of persuasion. Rhetoric was the Roman summit of education because Rome, in its political life, ran on speech. The Senate debated in speech. The law courts operated in speech. The political career of an ambitious Roman required the ability to stand up in public and compel an audience, to select the right words, arrange them in the right order, deliver them with the right combination of vocal power and apparent spontaneity. Cicero, the greatest Roman orator, wrote obsessively about the craft of public speaking, and his letters reveal a man who regarded a failed speech as a personal catastrophe. Quintilian, in the 1st century AD, wrote the most comprehensive textbook of rhetorical education in antiquity, and it remained a standard text for the study of Latin in European universities into the early modern period. Girls were generally excluded from the formal rhetorical education, which was preparation for public life, a life from which women were formally barred. But the evidence for women's literacy in Rome is substantial. Women wrote letters, kept accounts, read for pleasure. The education of girls in elite households often matched their brothers in its early stages and diverged only when the curriculum turned toward explicitly civic preparation. The Roman literary tradition that these educated Romans participated in was, by the 1st century AD, several centuries old and of extraordinary richness. The works of Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Livy, Caesar, Cicero, Sallust, Lucretius, Catullus, the great writers of the late Republic and Augustan age, were, for Romans of the imperial period, the classics. They were the texts that educated Romans had memorized in school, quoted in letters, alluded to in conversation. They were the shared cultural currency of the literate class. Books, papyrus scrolls in the Republic and early Empire, codex books, the bound form we use today, increasingly from the 2nd century on, were produced in significant quantities by Roman copy shops, workshops where slaves, sometimes dozens of them, copied texts simultaneously as a reader read aloud, producing multiple copies at once. These were sold in bookshops that Marshall mentions as being clustered near the Forum. Roman literacy was not universal, but it was widespread enough to support a commercial book trade. Roman children grew up in a culture saturated with words, with stories, with the performance of language. Even those who never learned to read, and many did not, lived in a literate world. They heard public inscriptions read aloud, they engaged with literate scribes and businessmen, they absorbed the stories of gods and heroes from the paintings on temple walls and the reliefs on public monuments. Rome's visual culture was a popular literature for those who could not read the written kind, and so the child who began the day unable to form letters on a wax tablet, who spent the morning in a portico being shouted at by an underpaid grammaticus, who came home at noon to eat bread and oil and fall asleep for an hour, that child was already, without quite knowing it, being made into something that Rome needed, a literate, numerate, rhetorically aware citizen who could participate in the verbal culture of the most complex urban civilization the Western world had yet produced. Rome made Romans. It started young. It never quite stopped. Rome had, by any measure, an extraordinary legal system. Roman law, codified, argued over, refined across centuries of juristic scholarship, became the foundation of most European legal traditions and remains, in various forms, the basis of legal systems from France to Latin America to Scotland. The Romans created concepts of legal procedure, of the rights of the accused, of the distinction between civil and criminal law that shaped the Western understanding of justice for 2,000 years. They also had a crime problem that would have been recognizable to any modern urban police chief. The streets of Rome were not safe after dark. This is not impression. It is the repeated testimony of Roman sources from multiple centuries and multiple social perspectives. Juvenal describes, with bitter specificity, the hazards of the Roman night walk, the gangs of young men looking for trouble, the casual violence of the drunk, the window boxes and chamber pots emptied from upper-floor windows onto the street below. Roman law required compensation for anyone struck by such debris, which tells us it happened regularly enough to require legal attention. The figure of the mugging victim, lying in the road having been robbed and beaten, is a stock character of Roman satire because Roman satire described things that happened. The vigiles, Rome's night watch, were tasked with both fire prevention and a degree of policing, but they were not by any account a comprehensive deterrent to street crime. They were organised in 7 cohorts, each responsible for 2 of the city's 14 regions, and each cohort had approximately 1,000 men. For a city of 1 to 2 million people, this was not an overwhelming police presence. The wealthy travelled at night with armed slave escorts. The poor took their chances. Within the legal system, Roman law distinguished sharply between the treatment of citizens and non-citizens, between free people and slaves, and between the wealthy and the poor in ways that would strike modern sensibilities as straightforwardly unjust. A wealthy Roman accused of a crime could hire Cicero, or someone of Cicero's abilities, to argue his case before a jury of his peers. A slave accused of any crime against his master could be tortured to produce testimony regardless of what that testimony was, since Roman law held that slaves could only give reliable evidence under torture. The logic was internal and circular and entirely self-serving, and the Romans knew it, and they continued the practice anyway. Punishment in Rome was calibrated both to the crime and to the social status of the offender, another distinction modern legal systems would reject. A Roman citizen convicted of a crime might be fined, exiled, or in extreme cases executed. But the method of execution available to a citizen was beheading, considered a quick and relatively dignified death. The punishments available for slaves, non-citizens, and the lower orders of free Romans were considerably more varied and considerably more terrible. Crucifixion, condemnation to the mines, which was a death sentence delivered slowly through labour in conditions of extreme hardship, condemnation to the arena as a gladiator or as a beast fight victim. The cross was the punishment of the servile class. This is why the crucifixion of Jesus, a Jewish provincial executed under Roman authority in the manner reserved for the lowest class of criminal, carried the social meaning it carried. The law courts, the various criminal and civil courts that operated in Rome, were also theatres of advocacy. Roman law required cases to be argued by representatives, and the profession of advocate was one of the most prestigious in Roman public life. Cicero built his political career on courtroom advocacy. The famous case of Pro Quinctio, argued by the young Cicero in 81 BC, survives in full and shows a brilliant mind at work in a form of rhetoric that has barely changed. Identifying the strongest version of your client's case, undermining the credibility of witnesses, appealing to the jury's sense of fairness and their identity as reasonable men. Corruption was endemic. Roman magistrates, governors, and officials enriched themselves through their offices with a regularity that the law attempted periodically to address and that practice comprehensively defeated. The extortion court, the Quaestio de Rebus Repetundis, was created specifically to try provincial governors who had extracted excessive wealth from their subjects. It tried some of them, it convicted fewer. The governors who were convicted were typically those who had made political enemies powerful enough to pursue them. The extortion of provincials per se was rarely the animating grievance. Bribery operated at every level. Roman elections, in the periods when elections were conducted, required candidates to spend on an extraordinary scale, distributing food, organising games, paying the supporters who would vote the right way, and drum up support in their neighbourhoods. Cicero's letters refer to the costs of electoral activity with a mixture of complaint and pragmatic acceptance. The Pompeian Electoral notices that survive on painted walls, endorsements of candidates for local office, sometimes with the trades or neighbourhoods of the endorsers proudly noted, show a system that was, at the local level, genuinely participatory, and that was, at the citywide level, inextricably entangled with money and influence. The Roman legal tradition was also, genuinely, a tradition of legal protection. Citizens had rights, the right to trial, the right to appeal to the emperor in capital cases, the right to legal representation. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was not an invention of modern liberalism. Versions of it appear in Roman legal theory. The system failed these ideals constantly. It failed them systematically along lines of class, status, and political connection. But the ideals existed, and they were argued over, and they shaped the law in ways that outlasted the empire that created them. This is perhaps the essential tension of Roman law as of Roman life. The extraordinary achievement and the systematic failure existing simultaneously, neither cancelling the other, both genuinely Roman. The courts convened, the advocates spoke, the judges decided. The verdict was announced in the forum where the crowd pressed forward to hear it, and the city registered its opinion with the noise that was the only democratic instrument available to most of its inhabitants. It was not justice exactly, but it was a system, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it worked. Roman law was clear on the question of where you could bury the dead. Inside the city limits, the pomerium, the sacred boundary, you could not. The dead belonged outside, and so along every road that left Rome, for miles in every direction, the dead of the city arranged themselves, in tombs whose size and elaborateness reflected precisely the social position of their occupants in life. Because death in Rome, as in most of human history, was not the great leveller, but the final opportunity for a statement about who you had been. A Roman funeral was a public event. For the wealthy, it was a very public event indeed. A procession through the city streets in which the corpse was carried on a bier, preceded by hired musicians playing mournful music, accompanied by professional mourners, praefici, who wailed and beat their breasts and tore their hair with a professional extravagance that was understood as performance and valued anyway, and by actors wearing the wax masks of the family's distinguished ancestors. The wax masks of ancestors, the imagines, were among the most distinctive elements of aristocratic Roman mortuary culture. Each mask represented a Roman who had held a significant public office. They were kept in wooden cabinets in the atrium of the domus, brought out at funerals, worn by actors in the procession. For a great aristocratic family, this procession might include masks going back generations, a visual embodiment of ancestral prestige, the dead standing witness to the departure of the latest of their line. It was also a statement to the watching city. This is who we are. These are the people we come from. For ordinary Romans, funerals were simpler, but no less important. The dead had to be properly mourned, properly processed, and properly buried or burned, or their shade, the manes, might return to trouble the living. Roman belief about the afterlife was varied and never doctrinally fixed. The Elysian fields, the pleasant meadow of the blessed dead described in Virgil's Aeneid, coexisted with the Tartarus of punishment for the wicked, with a vaguer, greyer concept of the underworld as simply the place where everyone went, and with a widespread uncertainty about what death actually meant for individual consciousness. The coin placed in the mouth of the dead, carons or bowl, the payment for the ferryman, is one of the most recognizable images of ancient death. Roman burials often include coins in or near the mouth of the deceased. Whether Romans believed literally that caron required payment, or whether this was a deeply traditional gesture whose literal meaning had faded into cultural habit, is impossible to determine. Probably both were true simultaneously, in different people and at different moments. The same way that many people today participate in religious funeral practices, whose literal metaphysics they hold with varying degrees of conviction. Cremation was the dominant practice for most of the Roman Republic and early Empire. The body was burned on a pyre, the preparation of which was elaborate and expensive, involving layers of wood, incense, and sometimes wine poured over the structure. The ashes and bone fragments were collected, placed in an urn, and interred in a tomb. By the 2nd century AD, inhumation, burial of the intact body, was becoming increasingly common, possibly under the influence of Eastern mystery cults, including Christianity, that emphasized the importance of the body for resurrection. The shift from cremation to inhumation is visible in the archaeological record and tells us something about the slow transformation of Roman spiritual life. The epitaphs on Roman tombs are among the most affecting documents from the ancient world. They were written for an audience of passing strangers, travellers on the road who might stop to read, and they use this assumed readership to direct messages across the boundary of death, with a combination of formality and intimacy that still stops modern readers in their tracks. Dis manibus, DM, to the gods of the underworld, the standard opening formula, then the name, then sometimes the age, sometimes the profession, sometimes the relationship, beloved wife, devoted son, faithful slave, sometimes a verse, sometimes a simple statement, sometimes something that reads like a voice still speaking from the stone. One epitaph from Rome reads, "I was not, I was, I am not, I care not." This is Epicurean philosophy reduced to 6 words, and it appears on dozens of Roman tombs in various forms. The Romans called it the NFNSNC formula, non fui, non sum, non curo, and whether the people who used it genuinely held the philosophical position it encodes, or simply found it a comforting brevity in the face of the unanswerable, we cannot know. They used it. They found something in it worth saying. The Parentalia, held in February, was the annual Roman festival of the dead, 9 days during which the temples were closed, marriages were forbidden, and families visited the tombs of their ancestors to leave offerings of wine, bread, salt, and flowers. The dead during this period were understood to be present in some way, their return marked by the festival's name. At its close, the Carestia brought the living family together for a shared meal, a celebration of the bonds that death had not broken. The festival of Lemuria, in May, addressed a different category of dead: the restless, the improperly buried, those whose funeral rites had been insufficient or whose deaths had been violent. The paterfamilias rose at midnight and walked through the house barefoot, throwing black beans over his shoulder and repeating a formula 9 times. I send these, and with these beans I redeem myself and mine. The lemures, the restless dead, were thus appeased and dismissed from the house until next year. This is, as far as we can tell, exactly what people did, in the actual darkness of Roman midnight, walking barefoot through their homes talking to the dead. Death was not a Roman failure. It was a Roman institution, as organised and as publicly meaningful as the Senate or the baths or the circus. Rome organised its dead along its roads, remembered them in its festivals, spoke to them in its epitaphs, and feared them in its midnight rituals. The dead of Rome were never entirely gone. They were along every road that led into the city. They were in the wax masks that watched from the cabinet in the atrium. They were in the names that children bore, family names that connected the living to the generations behind them. They were in the rituals conducted in the cold minutes after midnight by a barefoot man throwing black beans in the dark, keeping faith with the ancient contract between the living and the dead. The city could not have been Rome without them. It never tried to be. We began before the sun came up with a foot pressing into mud. We end here, in the ruins, in the silence that took 1,000 years to arrive. Because Rome did not fall in a day or a decade. It diminished slowly, unevenly, losing population and purpose and the supply of clean water as the aqueducts fell into disrepair and no one had the resources or the political coherence to repair them. By the 7th century, what had been the most populated city in the Western world for 500 years was a small town of perhaps 30,000 people, their animals grazing in the forum, their houses built from the marble of dismantled temples, their lives conducted in the ruins of a grandeur they could barely imagine had once existed in this same place. But we are not here to mourn the fall. We are here to stand for a moment with the people who made it, the people who lived in the mud beneath the marble and called it, despite everything, home. The baker who was already at the oven before the first hour of night was over, whose bread came out of the stone ovens in the darkness and cooled on the wooden shelf as the city woke around him. He did not think of himself as a Roman of historical significance. He thought about whether the dough had proved correctly, and whether the fuel would last, and whether his apprentice would show up sober this morning. The woman on the 3rd floor of an insula in the Subura, carrying water up from the street fountain in the early morning, before the heat could make the climb unbearable. She knew every step of that stair by the sound it made. She knew the particular creak on the second landing and had learned to step around it because the family on the other side had a baby that slept badly. She carried water, she climbed stairs, she fed her family. The gladiator who survived his 3rd fight and began tentatively to think about the future. The child who scratched his first letter on a wax tablet in a portico school and felt the specific, uncomplicated pride of a new skill acquired. The old man who had walked to the baths every afternoon for 40 years and could no longer quite remember a time when he had not, who stripped off his tunic and entered the tepidarium and felt the warmth close around him like a familiar argument. The slave who dreamed of the rudis, the wooden sword that meant freedom, and woke to the chains. The freedman who had been that slave, who had run a small business for 15 years, and was now, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has earned something, applying for his son to attend a good grammaticus. The senator's wife, who was more educated than her husband and more competent than his advisers and had learned, through long practice, how to make things happen in a world that officially did not acknowledge that she existed as a political actor. All of these people lived. They were born in rooms that smelled of oil lamps and cooking fires, and they died in rooms not very different, and between those two events they navigated a city of extraordinary complexity an occasional grandeur and constant grinding, vivid, ordinary life. They complained about their landlords and worried about money and argued with their neighbours through thin walls and watched the sunset over the Tiber and ate their bread, dark bread, coarser than they would have liked, and drank their wine, mixed carefully with water, and went to sleep wondering what tomorrow would bring. They were not so different from us. They were very different from us. The distance between their daily reality and ours is bridged by the fact that they had bodies and desires and fears and the particular human combination of resilience and fragility that allows people to live well, or well enough, in conditions that a stranger would find impossible. They managed it. Most of them. Most days. Rome was mud and marble, terror and beauty, slavery and citizenship, bread doles and banquets, graffiti on the Pompeian walls and Virgil's poetry carved into the ceiling of the world. It was the first city in the Western tradition to confront what it means to be human at scale, to ask what happens when you put 2 million people together and tell them to be a civilization. The answer was imperfect. The answer was sometimes horrifying. The answer was also the Pantheon and the aqueducts and the legal system and the roads and the libraries in the baths and the letters that Claudia Severa wrote to her friend about a birthday party on Hadrian's Wall. The answer was finally people. Just people, doing what people do, living in the mud, reaching for the marble, finding in the gap between those two things everything that mattered. The lamp burns, Rome does not sleep. Not.